morning. Can you guys hear me? It's on. Okay. Welcome to the panel on death and dependence. I'm really excited about this panel. We've got some great folks for you who are going to share some really helpful and insightful things about just the role of mortality and dependence in modern life. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, all three of them, and then they'll go one at a time, present, and then we'll end with a kind of moderated discussion, and then we'll open it for Q&A. So our first speaker is Dr. Michael Balboni. He is a congregational pastor, theologian that lives in the Boston area. He's also the co-founder of the Harvard Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality. He's written a number of books and will be speaking on his research. Leah Libresco Sargeant, she's also the author of several books. Her latest book, The Dignity of Dependence, is not yet out, but she brought copies, so definitely be sure to check that out, buy a copy. She works, in addition to writing books on matters of dependence, she works in family policy in Washington, D.C., is raising 3 children with her husband in Maryland, and she also runs a Substack newsletter, Other Feminisms. And then we also have Eva Ting. She's the founder and CEO of Here to Honor, which is a social enterprise fostering community through end-of-life education and events. She's served as the director of W83 Ministry Center at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. And she'll be sharing her experience working on educating people through end-of-life issues. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Michael Balboni.
And I'm going to stand here so I can see the screen. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about Christian theology and the experience of serious illness, particularly around how those who are using religion, particularly Christians, use religion in the experience of serious illness in ways that are sometimes helpful, but also not so helpful. And I just wanted, if I were to summarize my talk today, our culture is a death-denying culture that turns to medical technology sometimes as a way to avoid death and dying and thinking about it. And the church has been largely complicit in this cultural project of death denial. That's my claim. And though it's a theology, the church's theology has been unconsciously co-opted, the church retains, Christian theology retains a rebalancing, which I'll talk to you about at the end of the talk. So first of all, Death is Taboo, a famous book by Philip Arias, who had talked about that death was once very well known within Western culture, and over the 20th century, death has become taboo. It's a taboo topic. People avoid it, and they have constructed all kinds of social ways of avoiding death and dying, and it has infiltrated the entire culture. And he, among others, talks about how we've become a death-denying culture, this is also ironically infiltrated within medicine. Medicine itself uses, we argue, and my wife and I argue in this book, that medicine uses medical technology, and our entire society turns to medical technology, which is a good, and it's a good given by God, and yet uses medical technology as a manner of avoidance, and of avoidance of our human finitude, and that we are, in fact, dying, and medicine can be turned to and used in such a way to mask the fact that someone is dying, and there is an unwillingness to actually see that. Just one of the ways that we see this within medicine, I serve as a pastor in Boston, which is a major medical hub in the United States, and I work with a lot of medical students, residents, and young professionals, among others. And I see how the language permeates some of this death avoidance, and some of the ways that people are socialized very quickly around medicine is not to talk about the patient. Patient is Latin, originally Latin for sufferer, the person who is suffering. They'll talk about the case. they'll talk about the case in room 201, or they'll talk about the person with the metastatic disease, or they'll use various sorts of euphemisms in order to avoid the person. And medical professionals tend to do this because it's difficult for them, even though they're faced with death and dying all the time. It can be very difficult for them to actually acknowledge the person, because it forces them to confront their own finitude. And there are many impersonal energies that have been growing within the medicine within the 20th century. The driving social energy, I would suggest to you, is hospitality and compassion. Hospitality is the care of strangers, as in strangers are those who are going through the dangerous journey of illness. And doctors and nurses, are, among others, are places of, it's a hospital. Hospitality, it's the language of receiving the stranger in order to care for them and to help them through their dangerous journey. That's been the driving energy within within the practice of medicine over the last 2,000 years, as the Christian tradition has engaged it. And the impersonal social forces have always been necessary. Legal and bureaucratic forces, science and technology, as well as market forces, have always been necessary in the care for the sick. But over time, especially within the 20th century, we've seen the language and the institutions around hospitality and compassion decrease, and we've seen also how the other impersonal social forces are increasing. And we've also seen, I see this with, working with medical professionals, that they absorb some of these impersonal social forces. The motivations of why they're caring for the sick become more confused, and where hospitality and compassion, it's there, but it becomes more difficult and more confused. Ernest Becker, in his famous book, The Denial of Death, written in 1973, he describes the culture in which and how we have become a death-denying culture. And he argues that there is an underlying human terror of extinction, and our culture, in order to engage this terror of extinction, creates patterns of hero systems that try to connect us to immortality. And if you look at, from an anthropological perspective, from Becker's perspective, and a lot has been written on this, our culture creates all kinds of ways in which we're trying to avoid death and dying and connect ourselves to immortality. And religion has been the most primary way, and this has happened with the decrease of religion. We've turned to more imminent ways in which we try to connect ourselves to immortality. And many of the political projects that we see in our day, from this anthropological perspective, it would be argued that the reasons why there is so much energy, let's say around politics, is because of the decrease of religion, the loss of the rise of understanding of terror of our death requires us and for us to search for ways to become more immortal. And so we put it in enormous amounts of energy, for example, in politics, in the various ways around politics, and that's shared but both by conservatives and by progressives. But interestingly, medical technology is largely received as a good, and it is a good, both by conservatives and progressives. They actually agree on things, and this is medical science and the importance of medical science around death and dying is one of them. And I would argue to you that the church has been largely complicit in this project of avoiding death. Think about how many times you've thought about, or your pastor has preached on, or where you see the church really actively engaging death and dying, and where you're around it, you're close to it. We go from things such as funerals to celebrations of life. That's just one of many, many ways in which we tend to want to put death and dying in a little box, and we want to think about it as least frequently as possible. And this isn't just within the mega churches and the health and wealth gospel churches. This is really going on across all churches. African American churches, evangelical churches, Pentecostal churches, and I'll show you a little bit of data in a second on how that is. Now, our team at Harvard has been conducting research over the last 2 decades around spirituality and religion and the practice of medicine. And some of the surprising findings that we have found is that there are prospective associations of those patients who are relying on religion, and this includes particularly Christian patients, relying on religion to interpret their serious illness. Particularly, we've looked at cancer patients, and patients who are relying on their religion, they would typically called religious coping, are more likely to receive aggressive care at the end of life. And that's an important, that is a reversal of what you would expect. You would expect acceptance, and because we're going to heaven, why would I get more aggressive care? But it is actually, the data demonstrates it's actually the opposite, and that religious coping is associated with more aggressive care in the last week of life. And we also found that religious community spiritual support. So patients who are strongly supported by religious communities who come alongside them within serious illness are far more likely to receive aggressive care at the end of life. For example, they were significantly less likely to go into hospice in the last week of life. In this particular study, they were 2.5 times more likely to receive aggressive measures in the last week of life. They were almost six times more likely to die in the ICU versus patients who were not well supported by their religious community. And so what this is suggesting is that there's something about religion and religious spiritual support that is leading patients to make medical decisions to receive more aggressive care, and they're less likely to recognize their finitude and accept that they're dying. And that's been a kind of a project that we've been working on for a long time. I led this national study of clergy around the United States in which we randomly sampled 2,000 congregations and congregational leaders. And we had a significant response rate. The study was done in 2015. Most congregations in the United States are Protestant. You can see 44% were evangelical, 34% described themselves as mainline liberal, 12% Pentecostal. And this is an important stem of the question where we asked clergy, we asked them, imagine visiting a congregational member with cancer, and the doctor said that patient was extremely likely to die in the next 6 months, regardless of the medical care provided. Consider that the patient says these statements to you. To what extent do you agree with the statement made by this congregational member? So that's the context, and the next 4 questions will kind of give you a sense of how clergy are thinking about some of these theological topics. My belief in God relieves me of needing to think about future medical decisions, such as having a do not resuscitate order or using breathing machines. You can understand that there's a theological component of the question, and then there's a medical decision component of the question, and we're tying them together. And so the patient says this to the pastor, and we found that 29% of pastors, at least a little, agreed with this statement. Or the patient says, I believe that God will cure me of this cancer. This is a terminally ill cancer patient. This is the terminally ill cancer patient says this to you as a pastor, and we found that over 80% of pastors agreed at least a little with the statement. And you can see quite a bit or completely is also highly endorsed. We had this question, I believe that God may cure me. That's the correct theological way of thinking about it, by the way. May cure me of this cancer. And we had 100% of patients and clergy agree with that statement. So we had to change it. We said, not may, but we removed the condition, and it was will cure me, and we still had this incredibly high endorsement. Or a third area, I accept every medical treatment because my faith says to do everything I can to stay alive. Now this is getting at the sacredness of life, the value of life, because life is valuable. I should do everything I can to stay alive. And we found that over 50% of clergy, at least a little, endorsed and believed that this statement was correct. And then finally, I must faithfully endure painful medical procedures because suffering is part of God's way of testing me. This is kind of getting at the concept of redemptive suffering. And we found that 27% of clergy, at least a little, agreed with these statements. So we also did the study with terminally ill cancer patients, and you can see that among these 4 categories that were measured using those 4 questions, we found that clergy and patients were pretty high in endorsing both of these. So we asked terminally ill cancer patients, do they agree with these statements themselves, being in the very situation that they're in? And you can see a fairly high endorsement. And then we asked the clergy, which I just showed you, the clergy who are also coming alongside and agreeing. So this is a kind of conceptual map of what we found, and that patients with high religious coping and patients who are also well supported by their faith communities, they tend to endorse these ideas and believe them. And we found that with patients in the last week of life, that it actually leads to lower quality of life. It leads to greater pain, because when you're in the ICU, you're in a situation where you're experiencing more physical pain. It leads to higher death in the ICU. It leads to less hospice use, and it does lead to higher costs. And who are the clergy who are most endorsing these ideas? We found that Pentecostals, it makes sense. Pentecostals are the most likely to, in comparison to mainline Protestant clergy, they were most likely to endorse these. And then you can see evangelicals and African Americans as well. We also asked clergy whether they had, when the very last patient that they were with, to what extent did they talk about medical decision making. And we found that patients who, the clergy who were more likely to endorse these religious values at the end of life, they had a lower end of life knowledge, even though they were well trained and had high education, like such as a Master of Divinity. They had lower understanding of end of life medical decisions. And they were half as likely to talk to their congregational member. They were half as likely to have an end-of-life discussion. They would not talk about medical decision making. And then we found that those patients were half as likely to go into hospice and more likely to go into intensive care. It's the same pattern that we're seeing in some of these other studies. What I suggest, this is my last slide, what I suggest to you is that within religion and within religious community spiritual support, sorry, just hit that. Sorry, not supposed to ring. Within religious communities, there are theological ideas that are getting emphasized and other theological ideas that are getting de-emphasized. And if you look down the left-hand side, those are the measures in which we're looking at the theological ideas that are leading to medical decisions of more aggressive care at the end of life, which is also suggestive that the patients are less willing to accept and recognize their own finitude. And that there are other theological ideas within the Christian tradition that are not getting emphasized within the American church today, such as that we're stewards, and we need to foresee the future and make decisions now in anticipation of the future, such as having a do not resuscitate order or anticipating that being in the situation and giving instructions. Of course, God can do a miracle, but he often doesn't. Miracles are by definition rare. And to expect the miracle or to demand it is asking of God things that we should not be asking. Yes, life is sacred, but also life is finite. Medicine is a powerful gift, a powerful technology, and yet medicine is also finite. And there is a need to recognize the finitude of ourselves and of the gifts of God. And yes, suffering is something in which we can be, God can test us, and end of life is a way that we can be made more like Christ. On the other hand, Christ died for our sins, and the medicines and the palliation of pain is a gift that has been given and is not something that should be refused. And it's on the right hand of the column that I would suggest to you are things that have been de-emphasized and need to be recaptured. So with that, I will thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Michael. A lot of what I will be sharing will resonate with the research and the findings that Michael shared. So my name is Eva. I work in death education. Anyone heard of that? You know what death education is? Well, you're going to find out today. And I will start off by saying it was not on my 10-year vision board to work in death education. This was not something I was expecting to do. How did I get here? I've worked mostly in arts management and events management for nonprofits. That's been the bulk of my career. And I was working at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, overseeing events, and I found myself as the default memorial service coordinator. And so I would go into these meetings and phone calls with my events planner hat on and realize very quickly that funerals and memorial services are very different, primarily because we don't like to talk about death. We don't have these conversations, and so a lot of the planning doesn't happen until you need to do a memorial service. I'll share one story. Rob and Sandy, this couple, stood out in my head. So Sandy had been sick off and on for 10 years, serious illness, roller coaster health. And when she died, I was helping Rob and his adult children plan the memorial service. And we had all these conversations, and Rob kept saying, I don't know. And it kind of came out that even though she had been sick, they always prayed and God would heal her, what Michael was saying earlier. So they never talked about anything, and they didn't have anything in place. And so that's what I discovered, was that, this wasn't just unique to Redeemer. It wasn't just unique to the families I was working with. Because we are death avoidant, we don't have these conversations, we don't make these plans, and even in the church. And it's really difficult when someone dies to be grieving and to have to take care of all these things and make all these decisions. So that's where Here to Honor started. I started this organization primarily as a way to help people with funeral planning. But then I realized something. There's actually a lot of great resources and tools out there. The problem isn't lack of tools. It's because we don't want to think about death, and we don't know these tools exist, and we don't want to use them until we have to. And so then that's when we shifted with Here to Honor to move towards education. That's how I got into death education. This is an upstream problem. There's always going to be fires to put out when a crisis happens, like a death. But is there any way we can alleviate some of those fires? And that will take, proactive planning, conversations, acknowledging our finitude, recognizing that we're going to die. So what we need are not more effective tools necessarily, but people who are knowledgeable, compassionate, and available to journey alongside one another at end of life. So from that, our mission was born. We believe that death, as a shared human experience, can be approached with hope and togetherness. So our mission is to cultivate community around end-of-life learning so that everyone feels supported in facing mortality and equipped to make informed decisions. We do this by offering death education through different classes and workshops, and we also hold social events that kind of has a lower threshold for coming and talking about death. So what is death education? Quite simply, death education encompasses the study and understanding of death, dying, and bereavement. It aims to provide individuals with knowledge, skills, and perspectives to cope with end-of-life issues. Two very important aspects of death education. One is its practical learning. It's not just about listening to a podcast or reading a book or watching a video. It's very practical. We learn by doing, and we do by learning. And so it has to be done, and in a way that's done in community and together. And it's about improving our personal death literacy, even as we improve our community death literacy, because death happens in community and in relationships, and we need one another, so we need to learn together. So that is simply what death education is. What does that look like in terms of what Here to Honor does? Here's a little collage photo of different events we've done and people we've worked with. So we do a few things. We do have workshops that are led and facilitated by end-of-life practitioners, professionals, which include palliative care doctors, oncology nurses, end-of-life doulas. Have you heard of that? Death doula, end-of-life doula? So you know what a birth doula is? They help people with the non-medical support needs around birth. Death doula is at the other end, so the non-medical support around end of life. So we work with end of life doulas, lawyers, hospice social workers, and we cover topics ranging from estate planning to managing your digital legacy and assets, to how to have end of life planning conversations and how to fill out your advance directives. So these are workshops led by practitioners, but we always make room for community conversation, because it's not just about learning from professionals, it's also how do we learn from one another? How do we hear one another's experience, and how do we share that learning together? We also, like I said, host mortality-themed social events think you see some Halloween costumes up there. That was a Halloween-themed, mortality-minded game night. There are surprisingly lots of board and card games that have to do with mortality out there, of which I have quite a collection now. So we do game nights, we do quarterly book clubs where we read different books from different genres about mortality. We go on museum outings. There's been some really interesting exhibits in New York City where I live that have to do with death and mortality. And so it's just lowering that bar and normalizing how we engage with one another and talk about death. And then one of the things we do is Facing Mortality Together, which is an introduction to death education for faith communities. This is a one-day class we run right now, and it's geared towards clergy, ministry leaders, and lay congregants to learn together. And I'm gonna share more about this class and what we've learned from this class. So really our aim in death education, our approach, is how can we reimagine the modern village around caring for end-of-life needs? We've been taking care of the dead for all of human history. This is nothing new. We've been doing this since we've been around. But what does it look like in our modern global technological age? That is the question that we're trying to figure out together through the work we do at Here to Honor. We approach death as a whole person experience. There's a lot of medical components, but it's also physical, social, emotional, spiritual. And so technology is really great. It's really helpful. But we need ultimately at the end of life, not just a bunch of tools, we need humans. When I'm dying, I don't want to be holding the hand of a robot. I want to be in the room with people I love that I know love me, right? And so tools will only go so far. But it's also about how do we learn this work as humans and remember what we've been doing since the beginning of time, right? I think it's also for us about how do you do this work hyper-local. Ideas and things can be very broad, but at the end of the day, it's about your neighborhood, your neighbors, your communities. What are the local resources on the ground? Who are the relationships that you have, right? And so it's about how do we build those relationships with professionals and peers as we strengthen our systems of care. So we think the church can and should play a very large role in this. Facing Mortality Together is the class that we teach right now. It's a one-day class set up to examine the landscape of death and dying in modern America and explore aspects of facing our personal mortality through the lens of Christian faith traditions and practices. It's an interactive class. We have a lot of discussions, a lot of creative activities, personal reflection prompts, and we draw from different Christian faith practices and root the framework in scriptures. Why does this class exist? Well, I think Michael had a lot of really great points about how clergy are sort of responding and how they think theologically about death and end-of-life needs. And I was hearing from pastors personally when I was working at Redeemer how burned out they were, how overwhelmed they were. And we all know from the pandemic that was kind of exacerbated. A lot of pastors also shared that they didn't really know the practicalities around what to do at end of life. I remember one pastor who asked me about how to take care of a cremation. And I thought, I'm just gonna do the same thing you would do, which is probably Google it, because I didn't know either at the time. And so there were a lot of these practicalities that, maybe unless you've personally experienced it, you're not gonna know what to do. The church has also traditionally been the place where we take care of the sick and the elderly and the dying. And so how do we see that again in today's time when churches are often, there's a lot of transients, and especially if you're an urban church, a lot of young people. We're not living with multiple generations anymore. We don't go to the same church with our parents and grandparents probably. We don't get to see that up close. So what does that look like now? And like Michael mentioned, that tension of, praying and hoping for miracles and wanting every possible intervention, but also needing wisdom to navigate really tough decisions and conversations about medical care and planning, right? While also trusting in God. And so the other thing is we see a lot of these classes in church about marriage, dating, finances, but I don't see a lot of classes about how to prepare for end of life, how to care for aging parents, right? And those are things that all of us are gonna have to face. So this class, we've taught now 13 times since 2023 with different churches in New York, with over 135 participants so far. Different demographics, different neighborhoods, a couple different denominations. And what's interesting is that even in one day, we have seen a shift. So the red stickers are what people sort of self-described at the beginning of the day before the class starts. And the green stickers show where they are by the end of the day. This is slow work. This is really slow work, but what's encouraging is to still see a significant shift in perspectives and their comfortability in talking about death and thinking about death. There are some benefits that we're seeing even in the last couple of years that we've been doing this. There is no one path in death education. There are lots of different needs, and people will come in and out for different topics and different learnings that they might need at that time. But what's encouraging is that we are seeing people put things into real-time, real practice, real life practice. So one example is a woman who participated in our Facing Mortality Together class and then went on to participate in other workshops, including one about end-of-life planning conversations. And a few months after the workshops, she sent me this message. My father passed away suddenly on Thanksgiving weekend. We as a family were able to talk during our last meal together about my parents' wishes. That really helped guide us with how to honor our father and have peace about our decisions. So there is real life practice happening. It's also multi-generational. It's been really encouraging to see how people from ages 20s to 60s, 70s attend our classes. And so there's some really organic connections happening and relationship building and coming around and sharing about end of life. It's also making space that's not always there to talk about death. It's normalizing that. One of the first classes we did was with ministerial staff at this large church from different campuses, and it was the first time they were all in the room together sharing personal and ministerial stories about caring for the dying and going through grief. And they just never really had space set aside to do that. And so even for pastors, for congregants, to have that space normalized. And this is an important thing that we've heard from a lot of people. They come to this class wanting to know what to do. Just tell me what to do. Give me the checklist. Give me the points. But what they realize is that it's not just about learning what to do. It's about learning how to be present, learning how to listen, learning how to sit with others, sometimes in silence or severe discomfort, right? Offering and also receiving help. I think asking for help is often the harder thing for us to do. Most of us, I think, want to help others, but receiving help is really difficult. These are all skills to be practiced and muscles to be exercised. And it really is about being human, right? Being human and being relational. And so that's something that we actually intentionally need to do, especially when so much technology now makes it convenient for us to not have to sit in places of discomfort or be even physically embodied with one another. So I think all of this points us towards this challenge, and I believe a call for the church to radical, ordinary neighborliness. How do we see the needs of our neighbors through end-of-life lenses, knowing that we're all going to die and we're all going to need one another? How do we do that with the gospel hope of Christ, right? And how do we start with our own church communities to show up for one another in this way, to intentionally learn and then extend that to our neighbors? I think this is an amazing way that we can love our neighbors today. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. There are essentially two truly universal human experiences, and it's natality and mortality. Each of us begins our life wholly and utterly dependent on one specific woman, our mother. Each of us ends our life usually dependent on some arrangement of people who have gathered together to care for us in our last moments. And those two experiences, dependence in natality, dependence in mortality, are something everyone participates in no matter how long or short their life is. The child who is stillborn is carried by her mother for her whole life and cared by her still in death in that very hard moment of meeting and losing. The man who lives to be 94 has a long life in between those moments, but still has to begin and end his life in the care of others. And much of the middle of our life is dappled with dependence, whether through periods of illness, debility, financial disruption, being made needy because of how we respond to the needs of others. Each of us has moments throughout life where we must depend on those around us to sustain ourselves. And it's only by embracing this identity as fundamentally dependent creatures, not autonomous individuals, that we can embrace a good life for the whole of life and be prepared to give up our lives at the very end. A baby is not ashamed to be dependent upon being born. A baby doesn't, crawl around or writhe around thinking, it's humiliating that people are caring for me every moment. Horrifying someone is changing my diaper. A baby is simply present and accepts love and care as naturally as he or she does milk. But by the time we come to the end of life and those periods of need all throughout the middle, we've learned to be ashamed of who we are. We've learned to treat what is most natural to us, needing other people, being weak as we age, as though it is a singular and personal failing. And I think this drives a great deal of the impulse to put away conversations about death, to hide our needs from others, to try and buy care rather than speak to our children, because we see the act of being creaturely, the revelation of that reality about who we are, as humiliating and as a failure in a way that no baby does. And I think it's worth asking, in this secular understanding of what it means to be a person stands on their own 2 feet, a person doesn't ask things of others that they can't recompense themselves. What does a good death look like in those circumstances? What does a good life and a good death look like? In that ideal of autonomy, possibly a good life looks like being born a man, having this interregnum of need as an infant and child, but you grow out of it, so we're going to give it to you, where we understand you're working as hard as you can not to be a baby every moment as you learn to crawl, learn to walk, learn to use the potty. Thankfully, you got past it, and now you're out of college, you have a career, you support yourself, and your parents happily are not very old yet, so you don't have to support them, and none of your plans are disrupted by someone else's need. Since you are a man, your own sense of self-possession cannot be broken by pregnancy and the needs of someone growing inside you. And you're 30, 35, 40 maybe, and you're hit by a bus. Nice work. That was a good life. That was a good life because you needed very few things from other people. And when you died quickly and suddenly, and no one else had to do anything for you except scrape you off the pavement. And I think when we put it that boldly, it's certainly not a Christian view of a good life. I think it's a little uncomfortable even from someone not starting from a Christian worldview. But when we look at what we value in other people and what we're ashamed of in ourselves, we are catechizing ourselves towards longing for that kind of life and death. And that idea that our death should come ideally suddenly, if not by a bus, then in our sleep, with as little warning and fear as possible, is a profoundly unchristian vision of death. It's actually in some sense the death that Hamlet hopes for Claudius in the play Hamlet. Hamlet has a moment where he stands over his stepfather with his dagger and thinks, I could kill him now, but he's praying. And what I want is for death to find him suddenly, when he has no time to be shriven, no time to be reconciled, no time to die in friendship with Christ. But often, again, in our secular view of death, that's the death we're rooting for. A death that comes suddenly, without warning, without a slow slide to prepare for pain, but also to give up our life into God's arms. We're rooting for the death that Hamlet wants for Claudius, and he wants it for Claudius because he hates him. Because he wants what he sees as the worst possible death to wish upon him. But the Christian tradition of what it means to die has always hoped for warning, for a time of preparation, for a time even of suffering, so that we can use those moments of difficulty to be a moment of clarity. Now that I look clearly and honestly at the fact that my death is coming, what have I left undone, both in what I owe to others and in what I owe to God? And how can these final moments, as painful as they are, be a moment of truly asking for forgiveness, for reconciliation, accepting love, and preparing myself to die, accepting what God wants for me? I so appreciated your survey results of just the impulse to put off that moment, to assume, well, I may not know the day or the hour, but I'm pretty sure it's not now, right? There's nothing wrong in praying for a miracle or in praying for healing, but we have to recognize that even if we think God may cure this cancer, there will someday be a moment in our life when death finds us with no miracle except the miracle of the atonement to make safe our passage from death to eternal life. The idea of autonomy, the hatred of dependence, is profoundly dangerous for the weakest and most vulnerable in our society. A culture that sees dependence on other people as essentially unpersoning you, as taking away what matters most about being a created being, is one that embraces very logically the idea that the child in the womb is not a person. Because after all, a person could never need so much from anyone else. And therefore, when we look at the weakness and dependence of the baby in the womb, that is our license to turn violence inward. Because if a baby in the womb were a person, they'd be able to defend themselves. It's because they are dependent that we are licensed to kill. We see the same logic turned on the elderly, where it is the fact that someone who is very old needs so much from other people, needs once again to have their diapers changed, to be lifted in and out of a bed, to have someone else speak for them when they have lost the rationality to speak for themselves. The ways in which they come to resemble the infant in the womb, the infant newly born, we then once again say, well, perhaps we're not looking at a person at all. We're looking at something roughly human-shaped, but you can't let that deceive you. What makes a person is already gone. And it opens the door once again to the violence, this time of euthanasia. In Canada, 1 out of every 20 deaths comes at the hand of a doctor administering lethal drugs. That's a number that's been going up and up and up, and Canada is still working to make sure it will be even more as they expand their euthanasia pathway to encompass not just those who are dying, but those who are mentally ill. So in Canada, you can call one of 2 suicide hotlines if you're depressed. You can call the one that will tell you that life is worth living, or within the next year or so, you can call the one that says, yes, you have had clinical depression for quite a long time. That does make you eligible. We can send someone over in the next few weeks with a syringe. You get to decide which hotline you call. The government is neutral between the two. Canada aims to expand euthanasia to mature minors, children who feel their life is not worth living, including for reasons of mental health. And what I see in this rush to condemn the weak to death is actually something that very much parallels that instinct, even though it's working at opposite ends, to do everything possible to cling to life. It's the idea that death must come on our schedule and under our own authority, and that it is not something God prepares for us as our final moments on earth of love with him, that we accept his plans as better than our own. And whether that leads someone to cling to every single desperate measure because they believe they cannot possibly die, or to accept death at a doctor's hands because they believe they cannot possibly face a natural death. In both cases, the instinct is that death is unnatural to us, and that we've got to find whatever escape hatch we possibly can. This view of death and dependence, again, is incredibly lethally dangerous at the beginning and end of life. But it's dangerous to all of us right now. Not just because we know not the day or the hour. Anyone in this room who may think they have a long time to prepare for death, to build up their friendship in Christ, has no guarantee that anyone in this room, any individual